is Nancy Ukai. Nancy is the director of the 50 Objects History website, which explores the World War II imprisonment of Japanese Americans through 50 artifacts. It is the recipient of a grant from the National Park Service Japanese American Confinement Sites Program. 12 of Nancy's family members were taken from their homes in the East Bay in 1942 and imprisoned at the Tan Foran racetrack in San Bruno, and then moved by trains to Topaz, Utah in 1942. Her grandmother and aunts remained in the camps until 1945. Nancy was born in Berkeley and graduated from UC Santa Cruz in 1976. She moved to Japan on a Fulbright English fellowship and lived in Japan for 14 years, where she worked in Tokyo as a journalist. She lives in Berkeley with her husband, Jim, and is on the board of the Berkeley Japanese American Citizens League. She received graduate degrees at Rutgers Graduate School of Education and the University of London. Just a note, please remember to submit your questions on the chat function as you think of them during the talk. If you wait to the end, then there are delays in the Q&A system. So please welcome Nancy Ukai.
Hi.
Hi.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Paul. I wanted to thank Al Satake for inviting me, and also for Alan Barbman and Neil and Paul and Fred for kind of introducing me to your group and sort of smoothing the way. So I created a PowerPoint today. Can everybody hear me okay? And I'm going to share my screen and see if I can get this to work. Yay. All right, good. Let me see. Okay. So today what I'd like to do is talk about 3 artifacts in our project. As Paul just said, we're focusing on 50 artifacts and the kinds of stories they tell about how the imprisoned Japanese Americans experienced years behind barbed wire in their own country. And I became interested in this because I saw an exhibition at the British Museum called The History of the World in 100 Objects. And the curator of the British Museum could just walk around the museum and select things. And I thought this might be a fun and interesting way to humanize this history. So today we'll talk about a pocket watch, a toy tank that was made by a father for his son, and a Quaker quilt. And our project is covering 50 artifacts. We've only done 21 stories so far. And I just think, I'm sure all of you in your homes have heirlooms, family objects, whether humble or treasured heirlooms, that have stories which you may or may not know the full background of. So I really urge people to think not only of what we'll be talking about today, but the kinds of things in your own family living rooms or attics that you might want to talk about to the rest of your family so that they'll have a better understanding of their family history. So today I'll start out with a pocket watch. It's a gold pocket watch called a hunter's watch because it has a cover. And it was given to an immigrant man named Wasaki Hirota. And he spent 44 years of his life in Southern California in Azusa. And he spent 38 years of those 44 years of continuous service at the sun-kissed Azusa Foothill Citrus Company, where he was an expert pruner. And he received this watch from the president of the company as a quote, a retirement gift, because after President Roosevelt issued an executive order that made the West Coast into an exclusion zone for Japanese immigrants and Japanese Americans, for example, like my parents, everyone had to leave in the spring of 1942. So anyway, Wasuki was given this watch, and it's a very interesting thing. It's got his initials in it. It's 14 karat gold. And I can't even imagine other Japanese Americans or immigrants who were given a gift by their employer. So that alone makes it special. He worked right up to the day before he was taken away. The first assembly center, as they call it, a euphemism basically for a prison, was Pomona. And this is Wasuki about, 14 years before he was removed. He was married to a woman named Rafaela Martinez, and she was native born American of Mexican and indigenous descent. Interracial marriage was prohibited, so they had to go to Tijuana to get married. They had 4 children. And then on the right-hand side, you can see the exclusion zone where anybody with Japanese ancestry had to leave to camps that were in the interior. So that little red line I just put up shows from that family went from Azusa to Pomona, and then Pomona to the Santa Anita racetrack. And then what happened was Wasuki had to go.
Ready to connect another device.
Wasuki had to go because he was a Japanese immigrant who was unable to naturalize by law. His children, who were half Japanese, were required to be taken away. But his wife, who had no Japanese ancestry, didn't have to go, but she couldn't leave her family, so she went with them. Anyway, they went from Azusa to Pomona to Santa Anita, and then Wasuki went by himself to Heart Mountain, Wyoming, and the family was able to go back to Azusa. But before that, let me just tell you how I knew about this family and their story in the Gold Watch. In the National Archives, I came across a summary of mixed marriage families. It was a report, and it listed, they were case study number 4. This is at Pomona, and Mrs. Rafaela Hirota was noted as an American citizen of Mexican descent. Wasuki Hirota was a Japanese citizen. And then below that is their children and grandchildren. And you notice it says their appearance is all Mexican. So what happened was in this preliminary camp, while the internal concentration camps were getting constructed, the government started to rethink, what do we do with these families that are of mixed race? Do we have to keep them during the war? And they started to reevaluate their basis for arresting and imprisoning families of mixed race. And so what happened was they actually started evaluating the mixed race children by a new formulated security evaluation, and it was basically based on how white they were. And here's one example. This is another family in that mixed race marriage report. So this guy, Fukuzawa Ogawa, 63. His wife is Nellie. He was born in Japan. She was born in England. They got married in Maryland. Until 1940, they lived in Brooklyn. They moved to Los Angeles after that. Then he was rounded up. If he'd stayed in Brooklyn, he would not have been in prison. But at any rate, he was rounded up and she went too. But interestingly, you can see here where the government is trying to figure out how loyal are they. Well, let's see how un-Japanese they are or how Caucasian they are. So somehow some government person went in and said, well, their friends are 70% Caucasian, 30% Japanese. Their diet is 100% Caucasian, whatever that means. Their customs, they assign this percentage. So at any rate, because the children of Wasuki Hirota all had quote unquote American names, such as Herbert, Henry, Murray, and Lewis, that was considered a good thing. And this photograph was taken a year before the whole family was rounded up. And I just want you to notice the boys are standing in front of what we think is a Harley Davidson Flathead 45. And the guy on the right is named Lewis. And I just would like you to remember him. He was a pretty husky guy, and in the camps, he did some wrestling. One of the really interesting aspects of this story is that not only did Wasuki's employer write to the government and say, he's been a really great employee for 38 years. I will gladly take responsibility for him. He will not cause any trouble. That was denied. Meanwhile, Wasuki's neighbor was a guy named Roger Tarble. This, again, was in the National Archives. And he's writing to the director of the Heart Mountain, Wyoming camp where Wasuki was. And he's basically pleading for his neighbor to be freed. And so in the second paragraph, he says, I've known the Hirota family for some 7 years, as their home is just across the alley from my property. Mr. Hirota is 68 or 69 years of age and has been in the United States since the year 1900. For the past 35 years, which he has been employed by the Azusa Foothill Ranch Company, which has large holdings of citrus acreage in the vicinity. At the time he left here for the temporary camp in Pomona, he was presented with a gold watch by the company in appreciation for the good work he had accomplished during those 35 years. He is recognized amongst the citrus industry as an exceptional worker in pruning trees and in irrigating groves. He's married to a native-born citizen of the U.S., Mrs. Hirota, and then he just talks a little bit about that. He says at the end, I'm a World War veteran, a member of the Canyon City Post 180 American Legion. Our only son is a staff sergeant in the Air Corps stationed at Rantoul, Illinois. So you can see the above statements are not coming from any source derogatory to the war effort of this country. I would appreciate it if you would investigate Mr. Hirota's case and if possible, secure his release and return him to his family. I will stand parole for him, even to furnishing a bond if necessary. So it turns out this Mr. Tarble over the next 2 years wrote at least 8 letters to the Wyoming camp saying, could you consider moving him to the Arizona camp where it's warmer and he'll be closer to his wife? Would you consider? And they were always denied. But it was really heartwarming to know that this neighbor cared enough to go to that trouble to be writing these letters. So here's a photograph of Wasuki on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side, you can see he took a 3-piece suit to Wyoming. And you can see the chain of the gold watch that he was given by his company. Very sadly, he was separated from his family, of course. And 2 years later, at the age of 71, he died of a heart attack alone. So his children, Louis told me that my dad, my mother used to say my dad left home walking and he came back in a casket. And when I talked to some of the neighbors who were children at the time, they said, oh, we remember when the train came in and there was a large funeral. What also came back with Wasuki was the gold watch. And we learned that it was made by the Wolfen Watch company. It's 14 karat gold, it's 16 jewels. And it turns out that it's a size 6 Lady Wolfen watch. And it's probably manufactured around 1904. And that size is what would have been a standard wristwatch size by the 1940s. Pocket watches were, in the very beginning, attached to the wrist by strap loops. So they believe that either this watch had been unsold from the early 1900s, or perhaps this very fine case, because the Wolfen company said it's not damaged, it's soft gold, and it's a very high quality, had maybe been recycled with a new and with his initials put on it. So Louis brought this out at a family meeting when I went to go meet the family. And interestingly, no Japanese have been intermarried into the family since then. So, however, the Hirota name lives on through the men's line. And on the right-hand side is Louis Hirota, who is the grandson of Wasuki, his ancestor, whose portrait he's holding. And he's standing with his great-grandson, his name is Louis V. And he had asked his grandfather, why is my last name Hirota? Because kids at school were asking him, why do you have a Japanese last name? And so this meeting we had was a really, actually a very heartwarming time for people to get together and have memories of their ancestors. So Louis brought the watch to the meeting, which was given to him by his father. And he said, Nancy, I wound it last night in honor of this meeting, and it still ticks. So we were all very moved to hear it ticking at that meeting. The second object I'd like to talk about is a toy tank, and it was made at the Tule Lake Camp in Northern California in Modoc County around 1943, I believe. And the man on the right is the one who made this toy tank for his son. This is Itaru Ina, and he was born in San Francisco. And on the left is his wife, Shizuko, who was born in Seattle. They met in San Francisco. This is during their courtship in 1940, and they got married shortly after. So they were sent from San Francisco to Tanforan, which is now a shopping center, but at that time it was a racetrack. And then the family, Shizuko, his wife, was pregnant in Tanforan, but she gave birth to baby Kyoshi in the Topaz camp. during the time they were in Topaz, the government issued a loyalty questionnaire to they wanted to start closing the camps, but they felt they had to start figuring out who was quote unquote loyal or unloyal, something that should have been done before the camps were opened because everybody was swept up, citizen, non-citizen, with no charges, no trials. But at any rate, in this loyalty question, there were two questions, one that said, will you serve in the US military wherever ordered? And the other one was, do you forswear loyalty to the Japanese emperor? Well, if you're an American citizen, you have no loyalty to the Japanese emperor. And then the Japanese citizens felt they couldn't forswear loyalty to the emperor because even though they might have lived in the US for 40 years, they had no other country. So at any rate, it was a very controversial questionnaire. Itaru and his wife were so upset with the US that they answered no to both questions. As a result, they got sent to the maximum security Tule Lake camp in Northern California. And then from there, Itaru was considered kind of a troublemaker, and he got sent by himself to North Dakota. So at any rate, the family was in Tule Lake, the father was in Bismarck, and the family was separated. And Kiyoshi had chickenpox and was quarantined. So the father made him a tank, and he made it out of scrap pieces of wood. So those little round things in the tracks are sewing spools, and then other scrap pieces. And in the same camp where Itaru was were also German POWs. And there are many stories of the Germans teaching the Japanese Americans and Japanese citizens woodworking skills, although Itaru was already a really good woodworker. So at any rate, Itaru sent this to his son, and the mother said, Kiyoshi is very happy. I wish I could show you his happy smile. Last night, he took the tank to bed and slept while holding it. I don't know what he was thinking, but before going to sleep, he kept asking me, why didn't my daddy come home with the tank? Then he said an innocent thing to me. Tomorrow, let's go to the post office to pick up daddy. He made me laugh and cry. So we were wondering, why did he make a tank? Well, part of the thing is Tule Lake was surrounded by barbed wire fences, guard towers, and there were tanks, Sherman tanks. So, that might have been in his mind. But in addition, it was considered patriotic for children to play with toy tanks. And meanwhile, the government had stopped their mass production in metal so that, metal was precious and had to be saved for military hardware. So toy companies were converted into wartime production units, and parents were urged by the government to make their own toys using things like wood, paper, gourds, yarn, and items from nature. And this is a 1942 pamphlet that was distributed by the government. So this toy tank comes from the collection of Rosie the Riveter Museum in Richmond, and it was made actually by the Wood Commodities Corporation, and it has tracks that move. This is a little toy tank bank that is also at the Rosie the Riveter Museum. You can see that this one has a lot of drawings on it and has a very basic shape, and it's a bank. This one here is an interesting one. It's was actually in a German museum called the Deutsche Panzer Museum in Munster. And you'll see that's a T-34, so that's very interesting, and I'll show you why now. So we were trying to figure out what model is this. Kiyoshi thought it was a Sherman tank, but then and I'm certainly not an expert on tanks by any means, but I reached out to curators in the UK and this German museum, and Lauren Handel, who is the curator, said that it very much resembled the T-34. It's a Soviet tank, and that was one of the legendary Soviet tank, which was considered really the most effective tank of World War II. So it's possible that the father, Itaru, might have seen a news photograph, a magazine, and copied what he saw. So meanwhile, we found a Soviet-made North Korean T-34 that was used during the United Nations advance. That's in the upper picture, and you can see how much the shape of it resembles the tank that Kiyoshi's father had made for him. So in 1952, after the war, actually, Itaru and his wife Shizuko had decided to renounce their U.S. citizenship and go to Japan, but then they changed their mind. It just was too complicated. Japan was, struggling after the war, and they just felt they'd made this decision in the heat of the moment and decided not to go to Japan, where they had visited when they were children, but they were U.S. citizens. So at any rate, when Kyoshi was 9, his father took him to the East Coast for a road trip. And he said, my dad wanted to take me all to the patriotic sites. So they went from Niagara Falls to Grant's Tomb, the Statue of Liberty, the Liberty Bell, the Lincoln Memorial. And Itaru brought a tripod and took a photograph of the father and son at every point. And Kyoshi said he was a no-no boy, but he loved his country. He renounced his citizenship because he was upset with America and the policies they put on the Japanese Americans. But the trip told me that he loved his country and that he wanted me to love it too. And so this tank has been in a lot of museum exhibitions. And in 2019, it was one of the Presidio titled Then They Came for Me, which featured photographs and artifacts of the Japanese American incarceration years. And I think the point was to show that even within a child's tank, there are these very complicated stories, and that, if we don't want history to repeat itself, we must know what those stories are. So I'm going to end with one short 3-minute video. And this is about the quilt. And actually, it's this is Kyoshi's sister, Satsuki. And when the mother was incarcerated at Tanforan, people used to go to the fence every day. And the Japanese Americans would go there, and then friends and strangers would come and throw fruit and presents over the fence. And a Quaker woman threw over the fence a quilt. And I think Neil is going to play it for us. So I'm going to stop the share on my side. Yeah, okay, thanks. Neil, is there sound? Neil, is there? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, let me go back. I had
Okay.
myself muted, I think.
Sorry. Thank you.
My mother had this very ratty blanket. It was kind of always there, huh? Yeah, it was always on her bed.
Yeah, it was visible all the time when
Yeah.
she was around.
I knew that this old quilt that my mother had around the house, she had received it when she was in the camps. But it was when she was very ill and she had that on her bed. And I said, let's get rid of this because it's so ratty. And she said, no, I don't want to get rid of this. And then she explained to me in more detail about the story, which I didn't know. And she said that when she was pregnant with my brother in Tanforan, women from the Quaker church would come at certain times of the day and stand on the other side of the fence, and they would throw over fresh fruits and vegetables. And some people would go there to receive these fruits and vegetables. And my mother was pregnant at the time. And so when she was standing there, a woman had this blanket, and she called out to my mother and she said, this is for you. So she felt like it was specifically like the woman hadn't recognized that she was pregnant. And she took that blanket and heaved it over the fence. And it's this beautifully hand-stitched quilt. When she heaved the blanket over the fence, that the woman said, I hope this helps. So when I asked her, well, what did this mean for her? Because she had it in camp and then had kept it forever since then. She said that it helped to remind her that there were people outside who cared. Particularly the people of the American Friends Service Committee, the only major religious organization outside that provided care packages for the children during Christmas and had gifts sent by other Quaker children to the children in the camps. It was an important statement about what it must have been like to be isolated and removed, and then to have someone connect in that very personal way. Smells like it.
It doesn't smell like mothballs, that's good.
Thank you.
So we have a few questions that came from the audience. Jeff Johnson was saying he recently visited Hart Mountain internment camp, which was the largest city in Wyoming. Was there something special about Hart Mountain? I remember you commented and showed on your map.
You're muted.
Sorry. It was the northernmost camp, and most of the people who went to Hart Mountain were from Los Angeles, which is pretty warm. And so I think the first winter was something like 20 degrees below, and there was just, the barracks were made of green wood, and so it hadn't been cured. And there was a lot of just shock over the weather, and people weren't dressed properly. So each of the camps, for example, the ones from the Bay Area, people from the Bay Area went to Utah. And I'm not sure exactly how the government decided where people went, but Hart Mountain was mostly Los Angeles area and also San Jose.
And Sam asked, how big were the camps and did the Japanese Americans work there?
Yeah, they range from 8,000 to, in the case of one camp in Poston, Arizona, it was 18,000. So there were 10 sort of main government camps run by the civilian government, which held altogether 120,000 people, children to, the elderly. And people definitely worked inside the camps. They couldn't make more than the privates. So the wages were just a fraction of what they made before. So if you were a laborer, you would make $16. If you were a doctor in the camp hospital, you might make $19. And if you were like shoveling coal, you would make $12. But many people were making multiples of that. And one of the reasons I wanted to look at artifacts was because there isn't that much left. People had to pack up quickly. They sold things pennies on the dollar. Anything that might identify them as Japanese, people burned, they destroyed, they buried it. And so then when they went to the camps, they kind of had to start over and build furniture from scrap wood and so on. But then when they left that behind too. And so the things that are left behind are the only things that we have to show how people might have lived, what kind of memories are in them, and what kind of stories they have to tell us about that time.
I had heard that Tule Lake was also incredibly cold and desolate environment.
Yeah, they tended to be remote because, these were supposed to be confinement sites for people who were considered to be dangerous. So they did have to be accessible by a railroad line in order to ship people there, and they needed to have a water source. But, even for the people who were living locally, they were very scared because they thought, who are these people who are coming to my area, who the government says is dangerous? And they're so dangerous, there's barbed wire fences, guard towers, and sentries with machine guns. And so it was a very fraught time, both for, especially for the people who were there innocently and thinking, gee, my mother thought, I'm an American citizen, I'll never be taken away. Maybe my father will be because he's an immigrant. But everyone was shocked when the orders came. They were posted on telephone poles and things like that. And then the instructions were no pets, only bring what you can carry, bring utensils. And, you couldn't bring, for example, cameras were considered contraband, things like that.
Jeff asked, where did the occupants of Manzabar out in the Owens Valley, where'd they come from?
They tended to come from Los Angeles area also.
Okay. I remember hearing the stories. I think it was called the 442, was the Japanese brigade company. I'm not sure what it was. So what happened? I mean, the Japanese Americans from the camp went into the military, or some did anyways. What happened there?
Well, that's really interesting because if you were in the military before Pearl Harbor, in some cases you were classified as an enemy and then basically told to leave. But it was kind of uneven because my uncle was already in the military and he stayed. But most people were disqualified from being in the military. And so one man I know was, he's in Sonoma, and his father was in the military, was kicked out, and out of protest, when he was taken to the confinement site in Arizona, he wore his military uniform. And then he was so angry at his situation that he ended up being refusing to answer the loyalty questionnaire, and ended up being sent to Tule Lake, which became the segregation center for all the people who the government called disloyal. But at any rate, so halfway through, the government decided we should have the Japanese Americans fight for us if they want to. And that's the loyalty questionnaire is supposed to sort out the people who were considered worthy of fighting for the US government, even though their families were imprisoned. And so that was another reason that the loyalty questionnaire was so controversial, because some young men, and they're called draft resistors, said, we'll go, but only after you free our families. And they ended up spending prison time in Fort Leavenworth and McNeil Island. So at any rate, but there were many, 13,000 who went to the 442nd, many from Hawaii, and had the most distinguished record for the size of the regimental combat team during World War II.
Sam asked the question, did the camps have schools for the kids?
They did set up schools very hastily in barracks. They kind of lacked textbooks and frankly qualified teachers, because some Caucasian teachers came in to teach, and then sometimes they drew teachers from the ranks of the imprisoned people. Not necessarily everyone was qualified, so it was pretty uneven. And but there were kindergartens through high school set up.
How did it end? I mean, what happened? What's the experiences that happened? What happened there when it ended?
Yeah, that's a good question. By the end of the war in 1945, some of the younger people, for example, my mother, they could get what's called indefinite leave. If you could pass FBI security, the government allowed you to leave as long as you didn't go back to the West Coast, which was still considered a military exclusion zone. So my mother went to Chicago, and then she ended up in Washington, D.C. In fact, it's quite interesting. This University of Chicago geography professor, his wife Harriet, met my mother and said, I'd like to sponsor you out of Topaz, Utah. And so she sponsored my mother and a friend, and the whole neighborhood in Chicago protested this, saying, don't let them into our neighborhood. They're going to kill you in your sleep, and so on and so forth. But Harriet Platt and her husband, Robert Platt, the geographer from Chicago, University of Chicago, said, no, we're going to bring them in. And they were actually accepting refugees from Europe as well. And my mother was just so grateful. She had never met people like that before. And she named my brother, my sister, and me after the Platt family children. My mother ended up studying geography out of respect for Dr. Platt. So she went to UC Berkeley after the war and studied geography, and then returned to the art, which was what her original love was. But just to say that young people like my mother, who was 22 at the time, could get out and kind of try and find employment outside. And by the end of the war, the people were left were the elderly and were children. And for some of the elderly, especially the bachelors, they were in their 60s and they just felt, it was too late to start over. They lost their property, they lost their jobs. In many cases, they lost their homes. And so people would try and find these halfway places where they could stay until they could get back on their feet. And by the time the camps closed in 1945, they were down to, gosh, I should know this. The population had dwindled quite a bit, much less than the original 120,000. And people were given $25 and a train ticket. And then, and there's some very poignant stories sometimes of camp officials having to go look in barracks and kind of find people, especially these elderly men who were hiding and had become afraid and didn't want to leave, frankly. And they felt, gee, at least here I'm safe. I have a roof over my head and I have something to eat. But then they got kind of chased out and forced to be put on trains. And then meanwhile, everything they left behind got sold very cheaply to the local people. So that's quite an interesting report that this Minidoka administrator left behind, in which he described these things at the time. And then the pets got left behind, so all these stray animals had to be shot. I mean, it's pretty grim. People don't talk about the closing as much, but it was difficult.
Neil asked, where were the Japanese in Hawaii held?
That's a really great question. In Hawaii, of course, the Japanese Americans were a much larger proportion of the population, but it was determined that if you locked up all the Japanese Hawaiians, the economy would come to a standstill. And so basically some of the community leaders, religious leaders, language teachers, people who were considered to possibly have suspicious relationships with business people or the government were rounded up and put in a camp called Honouliuli in Oahu. And then there were smaller camps set up in the islands. But for the most part, the Hawaiians were not rounded up.
Oh, I didn't realize that. That's really good. Well, thank you very much. Oh, let's see, we have one more. How many internees did not survive internment?
Wow, that's a really good question. Jim, I'd love to email you the answer to that. There are lists of the number of people who died at each camp. People died of, bad health care. They died of old age. People were shot. 7 or 8 people were shot by military guards. So how many did not survive internment? I would say if there were 1,000 at each camp, maybe, who died, then maybe, but I don't want to say a number because I'm not sure. But some of the camps had cemeteries and you'll see little headstones that say baby something, baby Tanaka or whatever. And I actually had a half sister who died of childbirth at Utah. And in some cases, people didn't want to have a grave there because they thought they'll never come back. And so they would have the deceased cremated and then they carry the ashes back, or they carry the ashes with them. And actually, I'll just mention finally before I sign off that my mother had 2 friends in Washington, D.C. who she met when she worked at the Library of Congress after the war. And these 2 sisters were from Los Angeles. Their father had a grocery store. The father died in Billings, Montana. He was at Heart Mountain. He died of cancer. And so the mother stayed in the camp until the war ended, and she had his ashes. And then the mother went to join the 2 daughters who were working in Washington, D.C. And I had known them from the time I was little because my mother and these 2 women stayed friends. So about 5 years ago, they both passed away. And they had said, we want to be scattered, our ashes to be scattered in San Francisco Bay. And I said, well, that's interesting. You're from Los Angeles, but I'd be more than happy to charter the boat and go do that. So what happened was the attorney came out, because they weren't married, didn't have children, came out with 4 boxes of ashes. And I said, what is this? Well, 2 were of the 2 daughters. And then there were 2 for the mother and the father. And the father, who had died in 1944 in Billings, Montana, his ashes had been put into this brand new box at the time that his wife died in Washington, D.C. So there were these two sort of cedar boxes for their ashes, and then there were the two smaller boxes for the daughters who were in their 90s when they died, and I knew both of them. So we scattered all four in the San Francisco Bay, and even the person who operated the boat said, "I've never done this kind of scattering where it's an entire family, the immigrant parents and the children." And so anyway, I'm not quite sure where, sorry to kind of digress a little bit, but it just makes you think about the journey of immigrants and their children and how this particular war history affected where people ended up, and in fact, even where they were buried or scattered, and how they died. So Jim, thank you for asking that question.
Yeah. So let me turn it back to Sam. Sam, you're on. Thank you very much, Nancy. It was very good. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Nancy, thank you very much for a very interesting presentation on a slice of our history. And thanks again. Very moving.